So hello and welcome back to Living the Life, the Ministry Years. This is episode 1.10, part A. So originally we were going to be looking at all of John 2 verses 13 through to 22. But actually, as I've kind of put together the material, I don't want these to get too long, so I'm going to break it into two parts. So today we're just going to look at John 2, 13 to 17. In that context, I want to think a little bit about Jesus' kind of passion and focus on the temple. And then in the second half, we'll look a little bit more at the kind of historical context of some of what Jesus is doing, because that's kind of the emphasis in that place. So we'll break this into two different parts. I'll release them on different dates. So for now, I'm just going to read you up to verse 17, and we'll think about those words and what's going on. So, not so. All right. Now, the Jewish Passover was at hand. Okay, so let's just give some context to this. Last thing we were looking at was the wedding at Cana, and after the wedding at Cana, it says about how Jesus has gone down to Capernaum for a period of time. And just for a few days, and presumably at some point he's probably gone back to Nazareth. But why has John said that? We'll look a little bit more on all of that next week, but I just want to address a tiny bit now, which is John's Gospel very much is written, I think, if you followed this series right the way from the beginning, you'll see I strongly believe, not as a kind of a blind sort of faith position, but actually as a solid historical position. That the Gospels are early written and they follow the traditions that we've had handed down to us. So actually John is written before the destruction of the temple, but it is written after probably the death of Peter and possibly Paul as well. And actually it gives us a perspective on the ministry of Jesus that complements that's been delivered to us primarily through Matthew. And Mark and Luke are kind of variants on that, on the structure that has been given to us by Matthew. Matthew has acted as kind of scribe for the 12, and they have recorded events which are kind of universally understood. All 12 were kind of witnesses to in some way or other, and that's been the focus of Matthew's Gospel. John is giving us a perspective that does include the disciples, but actually is slightly broader because some of it goes before Jesus' real public ministry. And this is really the transition. He's performed one public miracle in Cana, so that was public. So remember, John is conscious of the fact that Matthew starts his gospel and Luke and Mark pick it up when Jesus kind of finally moves to Capernaum and makes that his base. So he's referenced the fact he's been there for a short while, but it's not about making it his base. That's not what I'm talking about. See, John is conscious of that. He doesn't want you to confuse it. But there were some things he did that had a public impact, and therefore people knew about them. And of course, some of those stories are circulating. So let's make sure you have this perspective. John is also wanting to give us a Jerusalem-focused perspective, which helps then explain the last week of Jesus' life in more detail. So that's a very simple kind of understanding of its context. So in that context then, Jesus is going to go down to the Passover feast and he's going to turn over the money tables, something which he's going to do at the end of his ministry. And John knows that everybody knows about that. He's not confused the two. The two are very different. The reaction of the people who react are different in the two. The implications are different, but there's something thematic that John does want us to pick up. That happens at this kind of relationship that Jesus has to the temple, and the fact that he himself is going to become the replacement for the sign of God's presence, the gathering point around which his people they gather for worship and so on, and also in terms of sacrifice, all of those things. Jesus is replacing the temple. And so by presenting this way, we see that both the beginning of Jesus' ministry and the end of Jesus' ministry are all framed in this relationship with what God has historically done in the past, and which was really tied to the nation state, with what he's going to do, which is going to open up the relationship he has had kind of functionally to his people through the temple and through the sacrifice system, which is now open in a much more relational way to the whole world. So anyway, let's get back to the text. because I said I didn't want this to be too long. So the Jewish Passover was at hand. So Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Presumably his disciples are with him. They turn up later. But also Jesus' friends and family. He's probably gone up with his family context. That's the last we had context. He'd gone to Capernaum with his mother. And we thought about the wedding at Cana. It probably has family connections to it. That there's possibly cousins in Capernaum if the gospel writer John is actually a cousin. So all those kind of... So there's probably some family context, probably some disciples at this point. And Jesus is operating much more as a kind of one-to-one kind of rabbi with those who are with him. So anyway, and he found the sellers of cattle, sheep and pigeons in the temple. Now, there's nothing in the Old Testament that says you have to buy sheep and cattle at the temple, or even before that in the tabernacle. You just had to bring it. It had to be a good quality one, and that should have been the case. But particularly at the feast times, there were kind of actual locations for selling that ran all the way up the Pilgrim Way, and they were managed by the temple authorities, and you kind of basically bought your pitch. So he found the sellers of cattle, sheep and pigeons in the temple, and so we're going a stage further now, and the money changers were installed. See, the money changers were sitting, but the reason it highlights the fact that they're sitting is that they're not kind of milling around saying, oh, what do you know, you need a bit of temple cash, I've got some. It's actually they have their paid positions. And that's a massive big outrage. We're going to see when we unpack this passage, this issue of trading at the temple has become a very hot issue. It's going to become even more so after Jesus' death and right up to the eventual destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which was actually understood in the rabbinic writings and the Talmuds as being God's displeasure with the commercialization of the temple. But this is right at the beginning of that unrest. And Jesus sees where it's going and sees that it's actually going to be part of why this system doesn't work, why religion doesn't work. Religion always, unfortunately, has a tendency to become commercial. So anyway, he goes on, and he made a rope scourge, and he drove everything, both sheep and cattle, out of the temple. And he spilled the coin traders' cash, even turning the tables over. And he said to the pigeon sellers, take them away, don't make my father's house a trader's emporium. And actually the Greek word is actually emporion. It's the word we get emporium from, so I put it in there. His disciples then reflected that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. And it drags in a reference to Psalm 69, which is fascinating because it gives a lot of prophetic kind of context to these events. And that's worth just kind of flagging. That it says here, his disciples reflected. So it wasn't instant. It is actually post probably the resurrection as they look back on these things and they see the significance. They had initially captured the fact that Jesus cleansed the temple at the end, and then as time went on, they said, do you know what, although it was a smaller incident, he did it right at the beginning too. So they're reflecting on these events and saying, actually, this was significant. This was significant. There was a zeal for his house, God's house, that Jesus always had. And because this is a much smaller event, it's the Jews, which could mean the authorities, sometimes it does, but it also includes others. It's just those who are there. So there are Gentiles potentially in the court of the Gentiles. That's the point of the court of the Gentiles. You can go in as a Gentile. But there are Jews there, and they kind of understand the preciousness of their religious system. And here is this hothead from Galilee, and we know that a lot of people complain about the temple trading. So we're going to find out, and we'll just think about it in a minute. It's there written up in the Talmuds how much people disliked it. So we know people aren't happy with the system, but who are you kind of driving out the animals? And so they're going to ask for a sign. Next time we'll look at that. So you can see, you imagine as it's happened. Jesus has come in, he turns over some tables, he kicks some money over, starts to try to drive out animals, and while he's doing it, people, whoa, what's going on? Some hothead from Galilee, nobody knows who he is. Well, there's a few people saying, actually, I'm a sort of disciple. Well, he's obviously someone who's working as a rabbi, but there are lots of people doing that. He's causing trouble, and so he's being challenged in that context. And he's going to get put out in a minute. The temple guard are going to turn up, but that's kind of later on while he's doing this process. And I wanted to kind of capture, therefore, the fact that in this reflection, Jesus' disciples have seen something of a replacement going on, and John is going to introduce it for us at this point. So the issue of trading in the temple, as I said, it does become quite big. At the time when this happens, there's the high priest, technically, is Caiaphas, who's going to oversee Jesus' trial. But he is a kind of the officiating high priest, because before him, there's a few before him actually, I think he finished in 15 AD, there was a high priest by the name of Annas. Now, according to the Old Testament texts on high priests, you're high priest until you die. But the Romans didn't like Annas because he was a very savvy political player, and they figured his officiating role at the temple gave him too much leverage and too much power to be an agitator. And so they banned him from officiating. So he technically had to hand over the high priesthood. But while that is a technical handing over of the functional side, from a spiritual point of view, he is still the high priest, and that's some of the things he's going to have promoted, absolutely. And so he becomes, if you like, the power, the spiritual authority, the power behind the throne of Caiaphas, who is the functional high priest. Now, why am I mentioning that here? It's very relevant when we look at the end incident, because we see the interplay between the two. But actually, after he was deposed as high priest, he gets a run of his sons, 5 of them, become high priest after him. And Caiaphas, who's not his son, is actually his son-in-law. And we're going to find this kind of familial domination of the temple and turning it into a trading opportunity. Totally really emerges from Annas. It's from his time. And as he introduces it, but it is taken further and further by the subsequent generations of his family. So by the time we get to the point where the temple is destroyed, the temple markets are actually referred to in the rabbinic writings as the bazaars of the sons of Annas, because Annas is now dead, but it's now being managed by his sons. So it's a Chanayoth Beni Chanan is the actual rabbinic writing. Probably said that wrong. Anyway, so it tells us. Here it is. In the Babylonian. So they tell us. Yeah, so that's where we get the reference to the markets as being called the bazaars of the sons of Annas. We also read in the Babylonian Talmud, it's referring on the events of 66 to 70 AD. It says this. It says, 4 cries did the temple court cry out. First, depart hence, you children of Eli, for they defiled the temple of the Lord. And that little reference is kind of drawing from the stories of Samuel. So Eli was this weak priest, and everybody's doing what they think is fine. Everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes, which is another way of saying he's just kind of letting anything go. Hey, you want to be spiritually belonging, that's no problem. And his children are even worse. And so Samuel, of course, is kind of called from outside the tribe of Levi and made a priest in that context. And again, prophetically straight away, you see something of that coming on here, because here is Jesus in conflict with the very system that means the Talmudic rabbis, as they look back on it, actually quote the context of Eli being supplanted and his sons who were so evil being supplanted by a different priest who's outside of Levi, because of that. And so they refer to referring to the sons of Annas as being like the sons of Eli. And Samuel tells us the sons of Eli were wicked men. And what would happen is, describing it, they would say, hand over some of the meat for the priest. And they treated the Lord's offering with contempt. And they said, what's going on there? Well, here's the thing. So you see, you come up to the tabernacle, as it was in Levi's day, and in Eli's day. And the priests are operating there, and there are lots of priests, but then there are high priests and lots of priests. And the officiating priest takes your sacrifice and he sacrifices it before the Lord, and he gets some very often to eat, and you sometimes get some to consume as part of eating with God, and sometimes it's all for the Lord. But basically there are bits of the animal which belong to the priest as kind of payment. So rather than cash payment, the skins and certain portions depending on what the sacrifice were. But in this context, what's happening is the high priests are saying it's not just as someone brings the thing in. We have a cut of everything that you as a priest are delivering. So you have a system that was kind of very natural. We come in to make our offering to the Lord. The priest actually officiates it properly, and he gets to keep some of that and that's how his time is paid, and that's how he lives. But actually we've created now a tier above that where the high priests are coming along, the sons of Eli are coming along, saying, give us some of your meat. You got paid some meat, now give it to us. and actually we can read more about that, how they'd stick things into the pot and just yank out a big piece of it and so on. And so they go on, and the Talmuds kind of explain that's how the Sadducees, who are probably because they're descended from a priest Zadok, so Sadducees, how similar they were, and that's how they were understood. So the chief priest sees them, and the them in this context, as it's telling us, is the kind of the portions of animal and the skins that normally belong to the priests. So they took the things that belonged. The skins of the sacrifice, which normally belong to the officiating priest, by force. They took those things by force, for they were high priests, and their sons are temple treasurers, and their sons-in-law are trustees, and their servants beat the people with staves. And we have a really nice little description here in the Talmuds that kind of really fills it out, drawing on the biblical kind of references, the sons of Eli. They're taking the payments and all of the wealth that would normally be part of just all of the thousands of low-level priests who are busily officiating, and that's how they survive. And they've turned it into a system where a portion of all of that is coming to the priests. And they have produced a system where not only are they selling patches, even as you run up, but it goes right into the temple and the court of the Gentiles. They're selling pitches for people to trade in. And they're demanding, which is why the money changers are there, you can't bring pagan money into the sanctuary, but you bring it into the court of the Gentiles. And in the court of the Gentiles, if you're going to buy a sheep to sacrifice in the temple, you've got to pay for it using special temple money. And we exchange that at an appalling rate. So you multiply it all up, and what was already costing kind of 10 times the normal amount, by the time you've traded your money with a pagan head on it at some exorbitantly terrible rate because it's so contaminated, that the temple guard, the temple money changers is kind of, oh well, we can only give you a small amount for that. You're paying a fortune for a very simple service. And actually in the run-up to the destruction of Jerusalem, as you look back, as the rabbis look back, they say it was this process that meant God was so unhappy with the temple that he allows it to be destroyed. But Jesus is picking up on it right at the beginning, in that kind of a context. And in that flow, let's just kind of go back to the words. So he says, take them away. Don't make my father's house a trader's emporium. And there's a kind of a really interesting little kind of tie-in with Zechariah there, because Zechariah looks forward to a day where the temple of the Lord does not have traders in it. So actually, in here you go, Zechariah 14. So on that day, there will no longer, this is the day of the Lord, on the day of the Lord, there will no longer be a trader or a Canaanite in the house of the Lord who rules over all. So by driving them out, Jesus, in one sense, in the physical, is trying to prophetically kind of work out something about what his life and ministry is going to do, which is actually to produce this spiritual sanctuary where there are no longer any traders. A lot of your translations you'll read, you'll see the word Canaanite rather than trader. But the word Canaanite which is a cultural designation, is used kind of for people who are merchants and trading. So you become like a Canaanite, you become a trader. So that actually he's kind of prophetically modelling something by pushing them out, which he is going to become the fulfillment of. And then, as I say, kind of keep it kind of relatively quick today. As they reflect on all this, the disciples look at what Jesus is doing and they say, you know what? That's really like that verse in Psalm 69, and they quote one verse, but Psalm 69 is much bigger, where it says zeal for his house will consume me. And we won't go through the whole psalm because it's not the point of today, but it's a kind of an ecstatic prophecy. It's the prophecy where the psalmist, who is so worked up in worship that he suddenly starts speaking stuff that is outside of their natural perspective and becomes prophetic. And so actually it becomes a psalm of the cross, and it has that phrase of sour wine or gall they gave me in my thirst, that's what they gave me to drink, which is quoted of Jesus on the cross. But I just want to pull out one other little bit, which just as a kind of an illustration of the sorts of things that are in Psalm 69, which actually give kind of, perhaps are all happening and maybe not referenced by John. I think actually in Psalm 69 it also talks about estrangement from my brothers. And actually Jesus will be here with his family, but actually we start to see very early on in his ministry Jesus is kind of moving from just being a little rabbi to being a public character. A public ministry causes tension for his family in different ways, but actually there's a reference to that in Psalm 69. But the bit I wanted to kind of draw out is actually the name Jesus appears in Psalm 69. It's in verse 29, I think. Yeah, I've got it here. Yeah, so it says, "Let your Jesus, let your salvation," but it's actually Yeshua. Let your Yeshua, and this is now the psalmist speaking. So it's not if you like the Spirit speaking through the psalmist now. It's the psalmist speaking. He says, "Let your Jesus, let your Yeshua protect me, O God." So the psalmist is calling out for protection from God via salvation, via Jesus. Let your Jesus protect me, O God. I will praise the name of God. Well, he says it, he doesn't know what's going to happen, but we identify Jesus as a name of God. He's a part of the Trinity. With a song, and I will magnify him with thanksgiving, and it will please Yahweh better than an ox or a bull that has horns or hooves. And actually those are the things Jesus is driving out. And actually it's him who's going to become the sacrifice, and we'll think about that next week in his response to them when we look at the second part of this kind of passage. But actually it's right there in the context, which as they reflect on it, the disciples go, oh yeah, zeal for your house. It's not just that because Jesus had a lot of it was zealous. It's because actually you take that psalm where that quote is from, it has all these different little threads, including the naming of what it is we look to God for protection through, which is by Jesus. And his salvation, Jesus, is something that actually, or is it the it that we praise it? Actually, that if I praise what Jesus has done, then that's better as an offering to the Lord than bulls or rams or anything that's got hooves. And so can you see the way in which, in this kind of wonderfully multi-layered, very Jewish way, which doesn't bother to take the time to explain it all, but you start to feel it now, you read it and meditate, you go, okay, I see how that relates. So actually the temple is kind of key, because what Jesus' ministry is going to do is remove all the functions that naturally belong to the temple, and he replaces them in his own body, as we're going to have explained next time. But hopefully that's an inspiring kind of introduction to this little event, this little passage. And so we'll see you next time in session 1.10b, where we'll look at the conclusion verses. So I'll see you then.